I knew that there was no reason for this Cold War, that there was, you know, Marxism and capitalism and so on, they all grew out of the same European intellectual matrix and could be reconciled. And I was working on that reconciliation as a philosopher. That same year in 1990, I also was invited to Moscow for the first time for a conference of philosophers of peace. And we didn't issue a declaration, so it can't be in the book, but I was appointed coordinator of philosophers of peace globally around the world, and it was a great honour. You know, and there's still a lot of work to be done. But we sensed in 1990 the great possibility of healing this split between East and West, Russia, the Soviet Union, as it then was, and the whole of Europe and the Americas and the planet, right? So that was an amazing thing, and I give the whole thing. Now the Russians and Gorbachev, who signed that, say the Americans never stuck to their part of the bargain. They cheated. They were not supposed to sort of try and get other European states into NATO. They were not supposed to have military bases, you know, and then detach Ukraine from Russia and try and make it into a sort of NATO anti-Russian state. I mean, I think the USA has an awful lot to answer for in the way that it delivered on this treaty it signed. I think dark forces of imperial, neo-imperialism, you know, dominated American policy. Actually, I think it goes back to the assassination of Kennedy. I think the last seriously intelligent president was killed in Dallas. Reagan was not very intelligent, but I think he was a morally, you know, he was an intelligent heart man, which is why he signed the treaty. But since then, apart from Carter, who was also quite an intelligent man, I think the quality has been going downhill until we get to the current incumbent at the White House, who, well, I'm not sure he would even understand this book if it was given to him as a present. But he ought to read it, because these are treaties that his country has signed. Anyway, the Charter of Paris, very important. The next thing in there is 1991, and this is the first of two major global constitutional plans. On the World Intellectual Forum, which I serve on as coordinator for Europe, we have several global thinkers who want to solve the problems of the planet by having a world governance system that is like the UN but even better organised. Their complaint is that the UN is not really capable of bringing peace because it's not taken seriously. Okay, they have a nice building in New York, they have posh offices, they have some staff, they have a mechanism to do stuff, but it's all finger in the dike stuff. They're always reacting to problems. They're always sending emergency aid to X or Y. They're always dealing with this crisis or that hurricane. I mean, they have basic emergency infrastructure in place. Their budget isn't very big. Countries are always late delivering the budget. Countries are always playing silly politics like resigning, you know, like America's doing with the WHO at the moment, cutting the budget. They've already left UNESCO, which is one of the most important of all UN projects, and which issued that declaration on education for peace. And Israel's also left UNESCO. You know, Israel's a very reluctant and unhelpful member of the United Nations, especially since Palestine was allowed to join UNESCO. So all that politics is going on, and it means that the thing never really happens to actually do any peace building. Although the UN has set up a commission on peace building, but you know, it's not been really pulling its weight. So people came together in the course of the 70s and 80s, culminating in a conference in 1991 in Troia, in Portugal, in May, where they signed into being a constitution for the Federation of Earth. Now, this is a historic document. It's very well written. I've gone into it in detail. The whole thing is here in English. This book is in English, even if the formal treaties aren't. It's been translated into many languages, this constitution. And my colleague, Professor Glenn Martin, a philosopher from the States, who's president of the body behind it, argues this is the best constitution we've got to to create a world governance system based on peace. And it's in a book of peace declarations, because this is a peace declaration. Their idea is there will be a world governance system without an army, without police forces, without intelligence services, and that when you join it, you have to abolish your weapons of mass destruction. So it will be not armed with nuclear weapons, it will not have biological weapons and so on. It's a very visionary treaty, and there are many people around the world who are endorsing this, supporting it, and I was very interested to see the signature of the late Tony Benn as one of the supporters of this treaty, or this declaration. And yeah, and there are many people that still think it's our best hope. So I give the treaty in full, the Constitution for the Federation of Earth. And you can read it in the book, and it's been going since the 1991 promulgation. It was a new edition. Okay, then in the same year, 91, there was a National Peace Accord signed in South Africa. You may remember. Mandela was let out of prison. De Klerk and him got this National Peace Accord signed. With difficulty, of course, there are always hawks who don't like peace and oppose it and try and shoot it down. Normally they have military links or military intelligence links. But they got this one through. De Klerk and Mandela were determined to prevent South Africa, going down into the path of the bloodbath. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up for South Africa, and they managed, by a miracle, to get South Africa on a peace path, a rainbow nation. The text is there. It's very interesting to read back on this National Peace Accord. In 92, there was a very important Rio Declaration on the environment and development in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, when there was a historic signing of this declaration, and yeah, it was really the first huge international conference of UN leaders and others, NGOs, about the environment and development, which is still a huge issue. All the issues like climate change and stuff were first addressed at this big conference. And I give the declaration in full. Then in 93, the next year, there was a World Parliament of Religions met. And it met in Chicago in 1993. Now, I didn't go to that one, but I went to India for the first time in 93. We had another celebratory conference in Bangalore. 100 years after the Chicago World Parliament of Religions, there were two celebrations, one in India for Asia and one in the States, in Chicago. I decided to go to the Bangalore one, and it was an amazing trip. Flew to Delhi, got the train down south, explored various ashrams, went to Oroville, and then went to Bangalore, travelling by coach and train, and went to Sri Ramana Maharshi's ashram, Tiruvannamalai, and totally fell in love with India. It's an amazing country. It felt like coming home. And so both were important. I haven't been able to find the declaration we issued in Bangalore, but I got the Chicago Declaration of 1993. Okay, so also that year, there was the Oslo Peace Accords signed after some intensive peace work in Oslo in Norway, city I know and love well, where they present the Nobel Peace Prize every year. Lo and behold, behind the scenes, the Israelis and Palestinians actually got a peace treaty signed. I mean, incredible to think about it now. And that was in 1993. I mean, for God's sake, that's over, that's an awfully long time ago. And it was not a bad treaty. I give the full text here in this book. And this has never been done before. I'm the first guy to actually compile all these texts. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Anyway, it was a good treaty. The trouble is, of course, that 2 years later, the Israeli chief who signed it, Rabin, was assassinated in a right-wing coup behind the scenes, a conspiracy. As usual with Lee Harvey Oswald and co, they always say it's a lone gunman, it's a madman. No, it was an organised conspiracy to destroy peace from the Israeli right wing. You know, anyone with a degree in history can see, you just have to put these things in historical context. You can see the patterns that recur. And since my speciality is, you know, the history of the last sort of 100 years and the search for peace, I can spot this stuff. And I'm not the only person. I mean, look on the internet. Of course, Rabin was shot by a conspiracy, who've basically been in power ever since. And the current manifestation is in Netanyahu. And these people are actually criminals who shot Rabin and then are trying to block peace with the Palestinians ever since. For reasons that I think are psychopathological. I'm sure Chomsky would agree with me if Chomsky ever watches any of my stuff. I watch his stuff, and he is an intelligent Jewish intellectual in America who, like me, has seen the long journey. He knows what is going on behind the scenes. You know, I'd love to have a conversation with him about all this. But anyway, I've just provided the texts. Most people don't know this stuff. They've never seen these texts. They should be in every sixth form citizenship class. You know, this book would make a great textbook for citizenship study A-level in the UK, but also in Europe and America, wherever. Okay, then we have a very interesting declaration in '94. That was the year I went to St James's Palace and met the Duke of Edinburgh for the first and only time to have a proper chat. We had a big interfaith gathering at St James's Palace with Satish Kumar for different religious communities. I was then a trustee of the International Sacred Literature Trust, which was publishing pioneering translations of books in English of core spiritual classics. And we published 6 books by then, and therefore we had this wonderful gathering at St James's Palace. I'd never been in there before. It's an amazing place in London. And actually it's the real centre of the British monarchy as a working institution. If you're appointed to London as an ambassador, you're appointed to the Court of St James, it's called. And that is the hub of it. And so, anyway, what's interesting is that same year there was another gathering of faith leaders who issued an Interfaith Declaration, a code of ethics on international business for Christians, Muslims and Jews, which was issued in May. Our meeting was a couple of months after that. And this declaration is brilliant. You know, they talk about business ethics, probity, honesty. Jews, Muslims and Christians should all sign up to this treaty and not cheat and swindle and all that stuff. And if you think about it, it's quite important because, for instance, the Muslims ban usury, but obviously Jews and Christians sort of tolerate it, and the international banking system is premised on it to some extent. What would it look like if we had a usury-free world? That was in Muhammad's last ever sermon, which, by the way, I give the text of that in the introduction, when he gave the final verse of the Quran, and he gave his farewell sermon, which was a peace sermon. And so I didn't go that far back. That was in 663 AD. But as I say, you know, there's some more volumes we could do in the earlier period. But I think the world might look better if we abolished usury. I mean, if we had a different kind of economic system, I think that's probably one of the big burdens on the poor. I mean, obviously the very rich quite like it because it's their income. Well, what would happen if we stuck to that last sermon of Muhammad? It would be very interesting. We could try it for a bit and see if it improves things. There are Muslim bankers and economists, some of them are friends of mine, who've been thinking this through. And you can still have a capitalist system which is not based on interest. So anyway, that code of ethics is important. However, there's one lacuna in that they don't mention the arms trade in that treaty. I think this was an opportunity missed, and I'm in my footnoting. I'm giving critical comments also, and I think they should have mentioned the arms trade as a business, because that is something that all Muslims, all Jews, all Christians, and of course other faiths, should be concerned about. You know, people shouldn't make profit out of creating instruments of war and death and destruction, which then bomb innocent people in Yemen or wherever around the world. And I think it's a moral issue, and the British people particularly should be engaged in campaigning for this. But, you know, war is a business, and economists have looked at this critically. We need to sharpen our economic thinking caps, from whatever tradition we're coming from. And I think there should be a second declaration done in St James's Palace. Prince Charles was involved in this one. He can be involved again. I think the business leaders of the Christian, Muslim, Jewish world should work towards a world where arms expenditures are 5% of the current levels. I say this in a later declaration. I think the world expenditure on armaments is obscene. It's trillions and trillions of dollars, pounds, whatever. And it's not buying the world's security. It's buying us like lockdown. Because the money that was spent on biological warfare research in labs, this is what's probably leaked and is causing this chaos. Well, it's got to be abolished. You know, we've got to start funding peace. Like, why aren't books like this in every school library around the world, or every college or university library? Instead, you get whole, complete ignorance about all this stuff. So anyway, Prince Charles, I hope you're listening. Then we have another very important event in 1994, which I took part in, great honour, the Sixth World Assembly of the World Conference on Religions for Peace. Now, that was the first time I'd been into the Vatican as a guest. We weren't there as tourists. We were actually allowed, and we met in the inner sanctum of the Vatican. Normally it's sort of shut off to visitors. And we had this amazing gathering in a conference room with the Pope on the platform, Gandhi's granddaughter and other faith leaders, the head of the Orthodox Church, Patriarch Bartholomew, leading Buddhists and others. And we met in the College of Cardinals, which is the actual place. It's like a little parliament room, where the current business of the Catholic Church is worked out worldwide. And there were several cardinals there, as well as the Pope, Cardinal Rinzi from Africa, and you know, others. And the Archbishop of Delhi was there, Angelo Fernandez, who I got to know quite well, amazing man, who'd been involved in Vatican II. He was a great theologian, you know, you call him a third world theologian. He'd helped organise the third world voice at Vatican II to make sure that peace and poverty and these other issues were addressed. So it was a historic meeting. Pope John Paul II was there. He wasn't chairing it, he was just one of the speakers. But he was hosting us. And I remember him sitting on the platform just a few feet from me saying, with obvious warmth in his heart, you know, I am so grateful. This is the first major interfaith gathering the Vatican's ever seen. And please come back, you know, and how important this work is. So I listened very carefully, and to the other speeches and so on. We then went off to Riva del Garda in the north of Italy, and we hunkered down for a 10-day really detailed conference of faith leaders discussing what we can do for world peace. This was in '94. And I came up with the idea at that conference, chairing one of the sessions, that what we needed was a multi-faith mediation service. All these conflicts around the world involving religion, kicking off in the Balkans, the Middle East, etc., Northern Ireland. If we had a multi-faith mediation service staffed by experts in A, their faith tradition, but B, who'd trained as mediators and understood the process, then we'd be available to send into situations where these conflicts broke out, like in Sri Lanka between the Hindus and Tamils and the Buddhists and so on. So that gave me the idea, and I went back to Britain and set that thing up. We had a training at Oxford the next year, and that's when my multi-faith, multicultural mediation service was set up, which I still run. And that came out of that conference at the Vatican. Anyway, I give the whole declaration in full. It's an official declaration, and it's looking back, you know, if only the world had known these things was happening. I mean, it was not in the press. Nobody's ever heard of it. So I give the whole declaration in full. There was also a declaration in Geneva that year on education for peace, human rights and democracy, given by the World Conference of Education Ministers, which was later adopted by UNESCO. And again, it's blinking red. It's saying we need to get the world's education system to focus on peace, both at university level but also at school level. And we have to somehow, tame the beast in us, or rather than schools being places of indoctrination which train up kids to hate the other, whatever that other is. I mean, in Northern Ireland, Catholic schools train to be afraid of Protestants, Protestant schools train to be afraid of Catholics, and so it goes on. The cycle is repeated every generation. The same with Palestinian and Israeli school kids. So this declaration shows a way out. It shows a peace path. And I believe that every child on this planet should have a holistic education, should have a joined-up education, and they should all get in their religious studies and philosophy classes, because I think philosophy and ethics should be taught in every school on the planet. They should get the full Monty, which is the whole periodic table. You can't teach chemistry and tell them there's only 3 elements. I mean, you'd be fired if you were a chemistry teacher saying that. No, there's a load of elements, and Mendeleev's table explains how they all interlink. Well, this is the periodic table of the religious and philosophical traditions on this planet, and it's designed scientifically to be comprehensive and holistic. And unless this is available in schools and seminaries and madrasas around the planet, we're going to remain illiterate. We're going to be remaining like chemists teaching only 3 elements. I mean, you can't make anything useful if you just have the 3 element knowledge. So there we are. all the details are there. And this is on my website, educationaid.net, which I set up at that time, Education Aid, as a project to boost for funding, for support for all these projects. That's, relevant. Next one, also in '94, was a declaration on the role of religion in the promotion of a culture of peace, which was done in Barcelona, and was important because it was UNESCO organised. Federico Mayor was there. And then we come to the next year, '95, the World Summit for Social Development. And this issued a great declaration, and it was in Copenhagen. I was there in person as an NGO leader, and it was the first time I'd ever met, so to speak, the world heads of state in person. They were all speaking at the podium. The then world leaders, Chancellor Kohl and Fidel Castro spoke. Heads of state, that's where I first saw Hillary Clinton. She was the Secretary of State at the time, I think. She came and spoke. And it was very moving, because what we were talking about was social development. It was an idea promoted by Chilean ambassador to the UN, Juan Somavia, that we can't get peace on this planet unless we have social development, which means ending unemployment and poverty, developing society, right, and also ending kind of ethnic conflict and so on. The 3 wings of social development, as the conference said, was ending unemployment, ending poverty, and ending social conflict, effectively, of whatever kind. Gosh, what a visionary event it was, and how appropriate it was hosted in Copenhagen, which is an amazing city, home of Kierkegaard and Hans Christian Andersen, and it was so moving to be there and to have a small part in that. Obviously, I had no part in the declaration. I was just an NGO leader, but I watched the whole thing, and we were sitting at the back. The NGOs were given a little bit of space. The official government spaces with their desks saying France or Bolivia or whatever, they were in the front bit. We were just at the back. And I discovered there was a little meditation room set aside, which I went and spent some time meditating in. So we were giving sort of spiritual support to the work of these political leaders. But, the declaration's not been adhered to. People signed it, but most of the people that were running the world then in '95 are now dead. They're not in charge anymore. We've got a bunch of relatively illiterate political leaders that wouldn't understand the concept of social development if you explained it to them. People like this Trump guy in America, I mean, they simply wouldn't have the intellect to comprehend what the UN was doing there. I don't think. I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but all the evidence points to that. And Boris Johnson likewise, hasn't got the slightest clue what this means, because otherwise he would never have done Brexit. Brexit is anti-social development. It's causing social, regression, whatever the opposite of development is. And it's caused huge tensions and conflicts in British society, and they will get worse. Huge tensions and conflicts between Britain and Scotland and in Ireland and so on. So we've slipped back, my friends, since '95, since I was there as a younger man thinking, gosh, we're going to make peace, we're going to get this through. This was just after we'd ended the Cold War in Europe. Now we were going to tackle poverty and unemployment and social conflict. Gosh, those are visionary days. Then we came for I wasn't at this one, but the declaration was made, a declaration on the principles of tolerance in Paris at UNESCO in '95. Epochal, because obviously we won't get anywhere without tolerance. So this was the first real international commitment to explore what tolerance means. And I think, sadly, since '95, the world has become a much more intolerant place. We have, pontificating political leaders who make a sort of living out of slagging each other off and being rude. And I'm appalled at the standard of debate in the British Parliament, which by the way, during this time I was organising seminars in the House of Lords, thanks to Lord Ennals, a very good Labour Lord, peer, who co-chaired with me about 30 meetings on ethics and peace policy. And the standard of debate in the UK Parliament was on the whole a bit better than it's deteriorated into. Like I say, it's as if it's regressed. And I blame the Brexit genie for creating that meltdown, because Parliament was hijacked by falsehoods. Next we come to the '95, the Lad-Nun Declaration for a non-violent world and ecological harmony through spiritual transformation. Now this is the first official peace declaration I wrote in this whole lot. It was in India. I was invited back to Rajasthan by Dr. Gandhi, who I've given this book to. And it was the first time I'd met Dr. Gandhi, and also Acharya Tulsi here, who was an older man, totally bald head, wearing a mask like Jain saints do, but who had an intellect absolutely razor sharp. I mean, he must have been 80s at least then. He died like within a couple of years, and but he was a razor sharp guy. And the reason I got to be invited to write that declaration is a very interesting story. I'll just tell you briefly. It was a conference in the hot blazing sun in India, and we were all there, several hundreds of eminent, philosophers and intellectuals from all over the world. And we all got 10 minutes only at the microphone, maybe 15 max, and we had to sit through everyone else. So, and this is the problem with conferences of that form, when you have so many amazing people to speak. You have to, and since everyone wanted to hear everyone else, so we were in one giant plenary the whole time. Anyway, I was scheduled to speak towards the end somewhere, because I was a totally unknown character and nobody knew my work. And there was no internet, obviously, in those days, or it was just beginning. And by the time it came to me, on the third day, I decided to not do my speech, because there wasn't time to do it justice. And as I'd been sitting there, I'd been thinking up loads of interesting questions about non-violence and about philosophy and its approach to violence and war and conflict and so on. But there'd been no occasion to ask any questions. The whole conference was just one speaker after another after another. And although most of these talks were really interesting, one wanted to have a bit more discussion and questions. So, being a sort of Socratic teacher, when I got to the microphone, I said, look, I'm throwing away my text. You can read it if you want. And I'm going to ask 20 questions instead. And then I just read through my questions that I'd been writing down during the course of my sitting there listening. And I was the only guy to do this. Everyone else just trotted out their speech. And then I sat down, and some of the questions were quite probing. You know, I later published them. I mean, they still haven't really been answered, some of those questions. And it's about the nature of non-violence and human incarnation and reincarnation, because these are Jains, right? These people can talk at quite a high level of metaphysics. I mean, one of the questions I have, and I think I asked it then, is if reincarnation is true and these souls are coming and going into life form, incarnations, what happens between lives? Why aren't they de-violenced? Or are they? Or are they allowed to carry on their deadly quarrels from life after life? So let's say you've got, I don't know, Saladin, a great warrior hero, and you've got Richard the Lionheart, a great warrior hero, and they're enemies in one life. And do they take that enmity on into future lives? Do they have to meet up at endless battles? Or is there some way that in the heaven worlds between lives, if Jains and Buddhists are right, and Hindus and Druids, there's a sort of interlife period, as past life regressionists point to. So can they be like turned into peace-loving people so that when they reincarnate again, they're no longer warriors? And if so, who's in charge of that educational process between lives? Because I don't think they're getting it right. You know, there are still souls being born on this planet that seem very violent and seem to want violence. I don't think that's right. I think, personally, you know, I'd like to see, if you want to incarnate on planet Earth, you have to sign a non-violence declaration. Like, I will not go down there and cause trouble. People like Steve Bannon, Nigel Farage, these sort of warrior types, Julius Evola, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, I don't think they should have been allowed on the planet. You know, there ought to be better soul control between lives, is what I'm saying. And I think that's, you know, that's very important. Because I don't think this planet should be a sort of tournament for warriors who come and slaughter each other. Because, I'm sorry, the weapons now are far too violent and sophisticated. If you want to do that kind of nonsense, go to some other planet where they're still at that level, like medieval times. So that's the kind of question I was asking, right? Deep stuff. And I think these are important questions that should be asked. And anyway, at the end of that that session, I got a tap on the shoulder and some monk was standing behind me, and I thought they were going to throw me out of the conference for asking too many questions. But little did I know, Acharya Tulsi, the head guy, had asked to have a talk to me because he had liked my questions. And so I was taken backstage and met Acharya Tulsi, and we had a discussion in depth. And he tried to answer some of my questions, and then he seconded a monk to talk to me over the next few days. And we had, when we weren't in sort of main panel discussions, we had some interesting chats about this kind of metaphysical questions about violence. And you know, in Jainism and Buddhism, you can't reach enlightenment till you're fully non-violent. But how does that process happen? That's the question. And since I'm an educator for peace and non-violence, that's the question I want to know. We can't all become Jains, we can't all, you know, sweep the floor barefoot with the ants out the way. But is there something we can do for, you know, for the average kid in a school in Nottingham or whatever, where I taught for some years, to make their lives slightly less violent so that we can incrementally get to a planet of enlightenment? Anyway, that was a really interesting conference. And anyway, as a result of that, I was asked to write the declaration for the whole thing, which was, I was not the eldest there by any means, not the most experienced. There were some really important people there. I was just like the scribe, really. So I listened to the whole thing and I tried to summarize it in the declaration, which is given in here in full. You know, it's published here. And again, you know, only specialists really in the field of non-violence and peace education have seen this before.